Cool. Hi, everyone. I just want to start off by saying thank you so much for coming. I see lots of familiar faces, so thank you for joining me today. My name is Patrick Johnson. I'm the head of discovery at the UK-based indie publisher Playstack. And today, the title of this talk is From Discovery to Signing, Balatro. So basically, just a quick little pre-introduction before the full introduction. I'm going to basically take you behind the scenes on what it was like discovering and signing Balatro. So I'm going to show some initial messages between myself and Local Thunk. Basically, just pull the curtain back, show you the forecasting, kind of everything that went into the discovery and signing process. What I'm also going to do, though, before that, kind of the first half of the presentation, I'm just going to quickly cover a little bit about Playstack, so who we are, what we do. I think a lot of people associate us with Balatro and Balatro only, which is totally fair, but just to give you an idea of the processes that we set up in advance so we could sign projects like Balatro and kind of the work that went into that. I'll just introduce everyone to the company very quickly. That's a picture of us all getting ready for the BAFTAs this year. That's a large chunk of the team, but we're about a 60-person team at the moment. We're London-based, as I mentioned earlier, London-based indie publisher, but we do have an international team, so we cover most of the West. We have people based in North America, Canada, all over Europe. I myself am based in the UK currently. So getting closer to 10 now, but 9 to 10 years of experience across mobile and PC console. This is interesting because we actually moved from a free-to-play mobile company to a premium PC console publisher. So having experience across both has been really interesting, and it's been really interesting specifically when working on Balatro itself. We have proven success across multiple genre spaces, so we don't limit ourselves, we cast a very wide net when looking at the kind of games that we'd like to work on with developers, and I'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on. Ethos based around publishing a smaller number of quality games, so when I first started at the company, we were looking at kind of a maximum of 3 to 4 games per year. We're now looking at a maximum of 5 to 6, maybe a little bit more if we can handle it. We're really focused on doing a smaller number of quality games, not biting off more than we can chew, not taking on more than we can actively contribute to. And of course, we're focused on long-lasting developer relationships that allow for full creative control. So introduce myself as well. I really hate this slide. I don't know why I put a picture of myself on it when I'm standing in front of you right now. But as I mentioned earlier, I'm the head of discovery at Playstack. This is a really fancy title that is very basic. I'm just the head of scouting, essentially. So I help with the scouting process. I'm doing what I'm doing now, but I also do financial and competitive analysis for all the games that we end up signing. And basically, I've helped sign all of the games that Playstack has published from the beginning of 2024 onwards. 5 years industry experience, so before I was in publishing, I was in freelance journalism. When I first started the company, I worked on Case of the Golden Idol and Entropy Center in different kind of areas of the company. We were smaller then, so more multidiscipline. Case of the Golden Idol, I helped with some of the English localization, and with Entropy Center, I actually helped with some of the QA testing. But these are most of the projects that I've signed since I started at Playstack. So Balatro was my first for the company, but I also helped sign Abe Artifactor, Lorne Vale, Unbeatable, which released recently, Darkwater, Voidbreaker, One Move Away, and the upcoming Recoin and PAX. I'm also the designated Jimbo carrier, unfortunately, so whenever I do end up going to events and we're lucky enough to receive an award, I'll carry the little clown on stage. Not my proudest moment. So what's the actual point of this talk? I've given a kind of a basic introduction there. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm going to talk about what we look for and how we look for it to kind of set up the case study of eventually taking that information and applying it to Balatro. How do we forecast and predict success? I think it's quite nice to be taken behind the scenes on that. Basically, just to show you how wrong we were and how wrong we continue to be when forecasting games, but how important it is to be conservative when you're wrong. Better to be wrong in the right way is basically the point of that. And basically, what does this entire process look like from start to finish using Balatro as the main example? So our aim as a publisher, so this is really important when it came to signing Balatro, but is to see every new game, which is extremely ambitious, but basically we have the tools set up internally. So the first half an hour to an hour of my day is looking at every game that went up on Steam the day before. We have the tools to do that, and I'm doing a quick visual analysis of basically every game that went up. That's how we found titles like Balatro and Abe Artifactor. Speed is really essential when it comes to scouting, using this process. And we can kind of take those games and we can organize them by follow account. We can look at each of them individually. So it's that kind of quick visual analysis on every new game, at least on Steam in this case. When it comes to scouting and signing games, obviously using an equal mix of analytics, data, and gut feeling when assessing projects. So I like to call this kind of 50% head and 50% heart. Obviously, games are art first. They are a creative endeavor, and that's the most important thing. You've got to feel passionate about the project. You've got to care about it. You've got to feel like you can work on it. Obviously, though, data does come into that. Is the game in the right genre space? Is it good enough to kind of compete with games in that genre space? Doing financials, forecasting, predictions, all of that is important. A lot of it's crystal ball reading, a lot of it doesn't kind of amount to the reality of it, but it's important that you have that so you can at least kind of qualify your data. Focusing on games with high ceiling potential. So I'll explain a little bit more about this in the next couple of slides, but games with high ceiling potential are basically games in viable genre spaces, and like I said, I'll explain more about that on the next slide. And to design the best games we can with passion and efficiency, like I mentioned, the efficiency part of this is just being as quick as possible. That's one of our main kind of benefits at Playstack is, because of the tools, we can be speedy, we can be lean, and we can sign projects that we care about very quickly if we have that bond with developers. So what do we look for? Now take this with a grain of salt. There's always a caveat when it comes to scouting games and discovering games, but this is just kind of some of the general things that I'm thinking about when I'm looking at games that go up on Steam every day. Visual quality is quite important, and by visual quality, I don't mean mind-blowing 3D graphics. I'm talking about kind of aesthetic cohesion, whether that be 3D, pixel art, whatever it may be. Case of the Golden Idol is a really good example for this, because I think some people look at that game and think it's quite ugly, but it is quite ugly in a purposeful way. It has that kind of aesthetic cohesion, and that was noticeable from looking at the game from the very beginning. So that is quite important. It's important for marketing, it's important for scouting. It's the very first thing people see, your trailer, your screenshot. So visual cohesion is one of the first things that sticks out to me, at least, when I'm scouting and discovering games. Like I mentioned on the last slide, I called it a high ceiling genre space, but existing within a viable genre space. And again, there is a caveat to this. There will always be the next Celeste. There will always be the next great 2D platformer, but at the moment, kind of, a lot of people aren't looking at arcade-style 2D platformers because there's so many high-quality games in that genre space. You're immediately competing with some of the greats. So when I talk about viable genre spaces, I'm talking about spaces that we might consider evergreen, on PC at least, so maybe survival crafting, maybe horror, maybe roguelike deck builder, and obviously those spaces kind of wax and wane in how competitive they are, but looking for a space that is viable is quite important during this process. Bringing something new to the table, obviously, or excelling in an existing genre space. So in the next slide, I'll talk about kind of iterative and additive games. If you are a game that is iterative, if you're existing in a genre space with lots of competition, you kind of have to be the best at this point because the market is so saturated. Otherwise, we're looking for kind of original or additive games that are bringing something new to the table. And one of the most important things is working with a dev or developers who are easy to work with. If you have a great relationship between publisher and developer, you can make amazing things happen. In our experience, it really is 50% of the battle sometimes. Obviously, having a great game is important, but that working relationship is almost equally as important for getting the most out of that game. So when I'm doing kind of that quick initial analysis, I'm looking at kind of 4 things, essentially, or I'm breaking games down into 4 categories. Now, again, these are quite nebulous, so I'm going to try and explain them in as much detail as possible, but basically we're looking for originators and additives when it comes to the games that we're scouting. So originators are probably the most difficult because they can kind of go either way. An original game, an originator in a space is something that is doing something almost completely new. It's almost defining a new genre space. And that can go either way, honestly. You can have some games that may be a little bit too original and don't have kind of a marketable audience. Or you can have, the stars can align and you can find something so new and so exciting that it's bringing in, it's giving birth to something completely new. Balatro is actually a good example of this. When I scouted Balatro and when I was doing the analysis for it, I didn't analyze it as an originator in the space because that's too much pressure to put on one game, and conservatism is quite important. But I think looking back in retrospect now, you might be able to call Balatro an originator since it birthed this new kind of subgenre of roguelike, these kind of parlor-likes, games that are based on, pre-existing games like Mahjong or Pachinko or claw machines and things like that. So it's kind of birthed this new space, and you might want to call it an originator. Additives are a little bit more safe, so additives are games that are existing in pre-existing genre spaces, but adding something completely new that kind of, enhance that genre space. So again, to pick an example for our own catalog, Abartic Factor is a really good example of this. So it is a survival crafting game. It has a lot of the familiar tropes of survival crafters, but it's doing something new with it. Not just the aesthetic, which is kind of a 90s gold source aesthetic, but it's also taking inspiration from Dark Souls in terms of level design. It's linear, it's not completely open world. You're not hitting a tree with an axe, for example. So we call that additive within the survival crafting space. So definitely looking for games across originator and additive. I'm going to skip over first cousin iterative and come back to it and kind of explain what iterative is first. I think that's probably quite obvious, in comparison to these other two. But an iterative game is something that is just familiar. You've played it before. It might have a new coat of paint. but really it's exactly the same. So maybe we take Slay the Spire, for example. There's lots of deck-building roguelikes that have all the familiar mechanics of Slay the Spire, but maybe they just have a different aesthetic. Those aren't really the games we're kind of looking for at the moment. First cousin iterative is probably the hardest to explain and maybe a little bit of an odd term, but basically first cousin iteratives, as we define them, are games that release very shortly after an originator, and they can see success by existing in that small space. So if we take Vampire Survivors, for example, I'm sure we all remember after that game launched, there were lots of survivor-likes kind of in the months preceding that game. And those games can see success and they can do well, but it's such a tight time window. As a publisher, and because of everything that goes into publishing, we can't really assist with those games, but they do kind of exist in their own specific subspace, so I just wanted to draw attention to that. Right, so I've spoken for about 10 minutes about kind of Playstack, kind of who we are, what we look for, how we define games, how we assess games, and now I'm just going to take all of that information and hopefully use Balatro as a case study to kind of, take you behind the scenes about how I reached out to Local Thunk, how we signed the project, and what our thought processes were during signing. So first question is, what is Balatro? It's a video game. That's the easiest way to put it. All right, I heard like 2 or 3 laughs there. I usually gauge this slide by what the reaction I get, so that's not too bad, not too bad. But what is Balatro really? So it's a hyperkinetic poker roguelike deck builder created by the Canadian solo dev Local Thunk. I think people love it for its, synergistic qualities, its depth of content, its simplicity, its elegance, and just also kind of the crazy things you can do with the game. The game is all about big numbers and exciting gameplay. So how did we initially come across Balatro? How do we find it? Like I mentioned earlier, we have processes internally at Playstack that allow me to look at games that go up on Steam every day. So I know Balatro went up on Steam May 24th, 2023, and it had 4 followers on Steam. So you can see from this graph here, I've actually got the SteamDB data from about a week later. So you can see it didn't go up too much. Started on 4 followers, ended up on 24 followers a week later. But I saw the game on May 25th. It was kind of in our list of games to reach out to. The interesting thing to note about kind of our attitude towards scouting games and discovering games around this time period was, I guess wishlist was still kind of king at this point in our minds. We were kind of looking at this in quite an old-fashioned way, that the more wish lists you have, the more followers you have, the more interesting your game will be to a potential audience. I think everyone kind of understands now that that's not really the case. Wish lists are kind of not as important as they used to be. Obviously, they can be a great signifier for success, but quality is always going to be the first thing, right? It's always going to be the king, and the job of a publisher is to maybe pick up games that don't have the highest wish lists or follower counts, but if they believe in them, bring them to the audience that they deserve. So the interesting thing about Balatro was it was definitely not #1 on my list of things to do that day. There were a couple of games with more followers on Steam that maybe looked like they had a little bit more potential. Luckily, it was kind of a slow day, so I did manage to get around to it relatively quickly, and I reached out June 6th to Local Thunk on Twitter via Twitter DMs. Sorry, these images are quite small, but I will kind of read out some of the key information from them. Literally reached out to Local Thunk. I believe he had 0 followers and 0 following on Twitter at the time, so this was super, super early days. Just the important things to highlight in kind of this initial conversation about the way we do things is we don't template anything at Playstack. We still don't do that, even as we've grown. The most important thing with contacting a developer and talking to developers is showing that you care about the game, that you understand it, that you actually paid attention and took the time to look into it. So I'm just listing some of the things that looked really interesting about the Steam page from Balatro, even in that early period. I could see the depth of content, the synergies, what the game was kind of going for. So I mentioned that in my initial outreach email. And when I message developers on Twitter or Blue Sky or other social media platforms, I don't go into quite as much depth as I would via email. I want to kind of carry that conversation on in more depth later on. Luckily, Local Thunk got back to me pretty much immediately, telling me that Steam is the best way to currently play it. He'll send over a separate build, but there was a kind of playable up at that point in time. He's already at this point saying that the game is at a point that he envisioned, really. It's quite representative of what the final game will be. And I said, thanks so much. You can see it was kind of the end of my day there at 5:23 p.m. So I said I would get back to him tomorrow to kind of talk more about it. The follow-up email I received from Local Thunk the same day. This was really interesting to kind of come across in this initial communication. It kind of revealed a few things that dictated the way I kind of followed up with the discovery process at this time. The things that I was most keen to, or the things that stood out to me the most in this initial message was, this idea of giving some thought to joining a publisher. So there are some developers that are very sure that they want to work with a publisher and some that are unsure. If a developer is ever unsure of working with a publisher, it's not really our job to convince them. It's our job to tell them what we could do to help them, and then, make good on that promise if we do end up working together. So my initial reaction was, well, I don't want to be pushy at all. I'll just be honest. I'll tell Local Thunk what we could potentially do for this game and see if he's interested in working with us. And then he told me a little bit about some of the things that he was worried about potentially with Balatro. Difficulty in marketing the game, which is something that we talked a lot about internally at Playstack. Says it's not his strong suit, doesn't particularly enjoy it either. And even at this early stage, I think he did understand that the game was quite special. He called it accessible fun. He thought it was good looking and replayable. But he also had no idea. He'd never released a game before, so he thought all these things, but he wasn't 100% sure if that was going to be the case. And like I said, interested in hearing what Playstack might be able to do, especially on the kind of marketing promotion front. So that kind of, played into my initial response. And this was back when Playstack, we're still relatively small, but we're even smaller at this point. We didn't have an awful lot of titles under our belt, so I had to use certain games as comparisons to kind of show Local Thunk what we could potentially do with Balatro. So the first thing I start with is just being honest and telling about all the things we can provide as a full services publisher, making sure to play into the fact that we release a smaller number of games per year. I think that's very reassuring for developers. You don't get lost in a crowd if you're only publishing 4 to 5 games per year. And then I talked about kind of some of the marketing we'd done for other trailers at the time. So we'd actually worked on a game with a Spanish team quite recently, Axolotl, and the trailer for that game went quite viral on YouTube, and that was a great example of showing off the capabilities of our in-house trailer creation team. So, a very passionate marketing team, luckily very strong in that area. So I was kind of using that to kind of show Local Thunk, these are the things that we could potentially do for Balatro as well, while taking into account the fact that this is going to be a difficult game to market. It's just cards on a screen. You've really got to play it and get hands-on time with it to really understand kind of the depth of its appeal. But that was kind of my initial response, sent June 7th. You can see this is all quite a tight time frame. This is all happening within a couple of weeks. And while we were sending these emails, we were also jumping on calls together and chatting through things in person as well. What's really funny to look at is kind of the initial assessment internally within Playstack. So what I'm going to show here is some of the feedback shared amongst the team and the feedback shared with Local Thunk as well. Again, this is kind of in the interest of transparency and showing you how wrong we were about a lot of things and how wrong publishers can be about a lot of things, but it's the idea that even though you're wrong, you're working together to kind of right those wrongs. So this is the feedback that I sent to Local Thunk directly, so this is both my own feedback and collated feedback from the rest of the team. We talked about all the things that are in the game currently today that we loved even in that very, very early demo. Variety, tons of modifiers, different decks, has a really nice kind of difficulty curve that eases you into the game, stellar mechanics. One of the things I'd like to point out that we were very wrong about, and very wrong about in retrospect, was, and one of the things I was quite keen on personally, was seeing a few more kind of fleshed out modes within the game. I'm talking about kind of campaign mode, time attack, which obviously in retrospect I think would have been a disservice to the game. I think people like Balatro because of its elegance and its mechanics and simplicity of said mechanics. So that was just something that we were thinking about in those early stages that luckily Local Thunk didn't listen to us about because it would have been wrong. And this is just for prosperity, and it's quite funny. On June 8th, I passed the demo through to the rest of the team. I said it's a card-based poker roguelite. I also called it a small-scale 2023 release, which luckily was not the case, but it goes to show kind of our mindset at that time. We thought this game would be much smaller than it ended up being. We did not predict success. So this is the light touch publisher feedback, which I've called wrong, bad, and stupid. This was the feedback that was shared internally amongst the team, and eventually shared with Local Thunk as well. And some of this still rings true for when the game was fully released, but when we looked at the game, we were thinking, right, well, it will likely have quite a low retail price. Essentially, how long are people going to play this game? It might be quite short. It might not actually have that much content. So pricing was a thing we thought about quite a lot internally at Playstack, and it did end up being quite a low kind of price game, but that was also to its advantage as well, as we ended up finding out. This one also still kind of rings true a little bit. It was extremely difficult to market. Like I said, it's the game that sings when you kind of get your hands on it, but it's very hard to kind of convince people through a trailer, for example, a very traditional marketing means. So the marketing approach that we take with a lot of our games, is to be kind of more influencer-focused, more demo-focused, having a cadence for a demo, putting it up on Steam, taking it down to build hype, et cetera, very organic kind of in that way. And one of the interesting things to also know at the time is when I was talking to Local Thunk, he wanted to release the game in about a month. So super, super quick turnaround. We ended up agreeing together to delay the game so he could add more content to it and turn it into the game he really wanted to make. But yeah, it was very stressful at first because it looked like we might be working together on a game that would release in a month's time, which obviously isn't enough to kind of get a full marketing campaign going. And one of the things for the initial Steam page as well was it was quite bad. Like I said, it was not really enticing players, it was not getting many wishlist numbers or a high follow count, and it really wasn't until influencers started playing the game that we saw that kind of massive spike in attention. But it was a relatively bad Steam page, and one of our jobs as a publisher was to go in and work with Local Thunk to make the Steam page better and more appealing. So yeah, the signing process, contract was signed a month later, July 2023, after kind of initial talks with Local Thunk. Not at all stressful, 1 month turnaround. Most of the games we work on take about 2 to 3 months to sign a contract, sometimes even longer. Abiotic Factor almost took an entire year, but Balatro was a very, very quick process. And you can read about it on Local Thunk's blog, so he has an entire timeline of how the signing process went. And he says here, I hire a lawyer to help me with all the contract negotiations, decide to sign with Playstack after speaking with studios that have worked with them in the past. So this was really, really nice. One of the things we always advise developers to do if you're working with any publisher is just to go behind their backs and ask developers that they've worked with before, what's it really like working with these people? They'll give you the good and the bad, and there's good and the bad to every publisher, no matter how good they seem from the outset. So really, happy that some of the devs that we'd worked with previously spoke so highly of us. So now to get onto the interesting part, which was the initial forecast for Balatro, which is going to be throwing myself under the bus a little bit here, because this is my work. But basically what we do when forecasting a game is we have a predicted wishlist tie ratio. So basically we try and work out a formula for what every wishlist is worth in terms of unit sales. And these are the kind of Balatro predicted wishlist and predicted sales. So if you have an original game in the deck-building roguelike space, you can have an extremely high wishlist tie ratio. Every wishlist can be worth 8 unit sales. Obviously, that's ridiculous. I took that kind of all the way down, even though I believed in the quality of the game, to kind of a 1-to-1, which is still ridiculous when you think about it. If you think that every single one of your wish lists is going to be equal to 1 unit sale, that's very, very ambitious. But we believed in the quality of this game. As you can see, so just to kind of take you through the numbers there, we've got basically a low to ceiling. So 39,000 units at kind of the absolute worst, close to 200,000 units at the absolute best. That was kind of the initial predictions for Balatro. And these are conservative numbers, and that was done very purposefully. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, it's okay to be wrong if you're wrong in the right way. I would never kind of juice the numbers and say, well, obviously this game is going to sell millions of units, because you can just never be sure. There's so many things that can play into that. But these were basically target unit sales that if we reached these, we would be happy, Local Thunk would be happy, we'd all be happy, and we'd all have worked on a great game together. So that was very, very important for us in the forecasting process. And this is basically what I did. This is a very kind of simple, inelegant chart, but basically I was taking games across the entire roguelike deck building genre space, and I was plotting those little red marks. Those are the unit sales from low to high, like I mentioned, and just plotting them against the competition. So, even if we were hitting the high, close to 200,000 units in that space, we would still be doing better than the majority of games, and we'd be on par with things like Luck Be a Landlord, which was, slot machine roguelike that existed well before Balatro. So yeah, we thought these were decent unit sales to kind of aim for. Very, very fortunately for us and for Local Thunk, the reality was very different. We ended up doing very well. We ended up selling a lot of units very quickly. And like I said, kind of in retrospect, realized that the game was kind of an originator in this space. So yeah, very, very grateful for the success the game has had. Very grateful for Local Thunk for choosing to work with us as well and allowing us to kind of have a hand in his project. One of the things we did as a publisher was basically take over everything. Even all the way from that initial email, he said, marketing isn't my strong suit. He just wanted to make the game, so we did socials, we did marketing campaigns, trailers, and he trusted us to do that, and we took over all of that so he could focus purely on development. And obviously that's not the case with every developer, but in this case it was kind of the perfect working relationship. So I can see I've got about 40 seconds left, which is great because I'm on the conclusion slide. But yeah, just to kind of conclude the signing process for Balatro, finding the game, things to maybe take away from this talk. Number one is that forecasting is really, really hard, and basically you're always going to be wrong. like I mentioned, always best to be wrong in the right way. Be conservative with your forecasting has really always been the key takeaway from me when publishing games. Obviously, you have to show faith in the projects that you work on, but you've got to find a reasonable middle ground. If you can find a medium forecast estimation where both parties are happy with the result, then that should be your aim. And if you don't think you can reach that aim, then I've told developers before, you're probably going to have a much better time with this project if you self-publish it, if you work with maybe kind of freelancers. So yeah, that's super, super key. Quality is also the main thing, as I mentioned earlier. Wish lists don't really matter as much as they used to. Having a quality game is first and foremost. Publishers are often wrong, better if we're wrong in the right way. And this has been proven multiple times already, but when I initially wrote this slide, the next Balatro isn't going to be anything like Balatro, and we've already seen that. The success of Expedition, Blueprints, the next great game after a great game isn't going to be another roguelike deck builder, it's going to be something completely new, in a completely new space, doing completely new things. So looking for the next Balatro has always been a futile exercise. But yeah, thank you so much for sitting and listening to this talk. I hope it was interesting, and I hope you could take something away from it. I don't think we have time for questions. We're probably going straight to lunch, but yeah, thank you all so much for attending. Really appreciate it. One question? Sure. So yeah, time for one question, if anyone has any.
Hi, I wanted to ask you which would be the main 3 red flags for a game, even if it looks good. Like you like the game, but you see, I can publish this.
Right. Yeah. Sure. I'll try and give 3, but I guess the main thing, when I was talking about viable genre spaces and high ceiling genre spaces, I've definitely come across a lot of games during scouting that have been phenomenal and I've loved on a personal level. But I think it's not necessarily a red flag, but you realize that they're not in a space where they can necessarily succeed, and not in a space where a publisher would be beneficial to them, essentially. If a developer is working on a traditional 2D platformer that's really good and really mechanically great, but you understand from the forecasting process that realistically it might only sell between 15 and 20,000 units, you don't want to be a publisher coming in then and offering your services, taking a potential cut of the revenue share or anything like that. So separating that part of yourself is quite important. Not necessarily a red flag, but I think something that a lot of scouts and a lot of people in the discovery process kind of have to come to terms with when looking at games. In terms of red flags, I guess not understanding the space that you're in or over-ambition from a developer's perspective. One of the things that I always really like to see in pitch decks, for example, is when a developer has listed games that are similar in size and space to the game that they're working on. One of the things that can be quite frustrating is somebody who's working on a third-person action game. I don't think scouts particularly want to see GTA 5 in the list of kind of comparable titles because it just doesn't make sense. But one of the things I really like to see is games in a similar space, but also examples of failures in that space as well, because that's what we're going to be looking at as a publisher during our own kind of forecasting process, and seeing that developers have already thought about the ways this game can swing in each direction, at least to me personally, is really important. And I will caveat by saying this is a personal preference, and most scouts and most publishers will have different views on what they necessarily want to see in a pitch deck. So sorry, not quite 3 red flags, but I hope that's a little bit of extra information at least. Okay. Awesome, great. I think that's that then. Thank you so much.